My mother-in-law refuses to give my son's inheritance and tried to get us to sign papers transferring it to her name. The bank told her she needed his signature to access any of it. My husband said, "You're not disabled, you're just pregnant," when I asked to stop working 3 weeks before my due date. I was 8 months pregnant and my feet looked like 2 balloons attached to my ankles. My back hurt so bad that I couldn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time. I worked as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic and spent 9 hours a day on my feet, greeting pet owners and carrying files back and forth. When I told my husband Rodney that I wanted to start my maternity leave early, he looked at me like I'd asked him to buy me a private island. "You're not disabled, you're just pregnant." He said it while sitting on the couch playing video games with his headset on. I reminded him that my doctor had recommended I reduce my activity because my blood pressure was getting high. Rodney paused his game long enough to tell me that his mother worked in a factory until the day she gave birth and that I was being soft. His mother also had 3 miscarriages, but he never mentioned that part. I told him we had enough savings for me to take a few weeks off before the baby came. He said that money was for the baby, not for me to sit around eating snacks and watching TV. I asked him what exactly he thought maternity leave was for. He said it was for after the baby arrived, not before, when I was perfectly capable of answering phones. The next morning, my supervisor Fred asked if everything was okay at home because I'd been crying in the break room again. I told him I was just hormonal. He didn't believe me, but he didn't push. Rodney texted me 4 times that day asking what I was making for dinner. I was on my feet for 8 hours with a human pressing on my bladder, and he wanted to know what I was cooking for him when I got home. I made spaghetti because it was easy, and he complained that we'd had pasta 3 times that week. I reminded him that he could cook if he didn't like what I made. He laughed and said he worked too hard to come home and stand over a stove. Rodney worked at a car dealership selling used vehicles. He sat in an air-conditioned office all day drinking coffee and waiting for customers to walk in. But somehow his job was harder than mine, even though I was growing a whole person inside my body while also working full-time. On Friday, my ankles were so swollen that I couldn't fit into any of my shoes. I wore flip-flops to work even though it was against dress code because nothing else would go on my feet. Fred sent me home early and told me to talk to my doctor. The doctor said my blood pressure was too high and that I needed to rest. She wrote me a note recommending immediate maternity leave. I showed Rodney the note when I got home. He read it twice and then asked if I could get a second opinion. I asked him why he wanted me to keep working so badly when we had enough money saved. He got quiet for a second too long and then said he just didn't want me to get bored at home. That answer didn't make sense. Rodney never cared if I was bored. He left me alone every Saturday to go fishing with his brother and never once worried about me being bored then. Something was wrong. The next day was Saturday, and Rodney left early for his fishing trip like always. I decided to check our savings account online just to make sure everything was fine. The account that was supposed to have $11,000 in it had exactly $412. I checked 3 times because I thought the website was broken. It wasn't broken. The money was gone. I looked at the transaction history and saw dozens of withdrawals over the past 2 months. All of them were cash withdrawals from ATMs near the casino 20 miles outside of town. My husband had gambled away our baby fund. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling like the floor had disappeared. My hands started shaking and I couldn't catch my breath. Everything we'd worked for was gone. I closed the laptop and sat on the couch staring at the wall, trying to understand how he could do this. Then I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time and then she said I should come stay with her. I said I couldn't because Rodney would notice if I packed a bag. She said to just bring myself and she'd handle the rest. When Rodney came home from fishing, he found me sitting at the kitchen table with my purse in my lap. He asked what was wrong and I told him I knew about the casino. His face went white. He started talking fast about how he was going to win it back and how it was just a rough patch and how everything would be fine. I didn't say anything. I just stood up and walked to the front door. He followed me outside and kept talking while I walked to my car, saying he'd get help and fix everything and begging me to come back inside. I got in my car and locked the doors and he stood in the driveway watching me drive away. My hands shook so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove straight to my mother's house and she was waiting on the porch because I'd texted her I was on my way. She helped me inside and made me sit down and brought me water even though I wasn't thirsty. I stayed in her guest room that night and slept better than I had in weeks because I finally felt safe. My mother brought me breakfast in bed the next morning and sat with me while I ate scrambled eggs and toast. She asked what I wanted to do next and I said I didn't know. She told me I could stay as long as I needed and that she'd support whatever decisions I made. Rodney called 17 times that first night and left voicemails that went from sorry to angry to desperate. My mother took my phone and blocked his number after the 18th call. The quiet after that felt strange because I'd gotten used to him always demanding my attention. I spent the next 2 days just resting and sleeping more than I had in months. My ankles started looking normal again and the pressure in my back eased up. On the 3rd morning, I called Fred at the clinic and told him I needed to start my maternity leave right away for medical reasons. He said he understood and that my job would be there when I was ready to come back. His kindness made me cry because I'd been scared he'd be mad at me for leaving suddenly. My next doctor appointment was 4 days after I left Rodney. The nurse took my blood pressure and it was lower than it had been in weeks. My doctor came in and checked the baby and said everything looked good. She asked how I was managing the stress, and I told her I'd moved in with my mother. She nodded and said that was probably helping my blood pressure more than any medicine could. Then she said she wanted me to talk to someone before I left. A woman came in about 10 minutes later and introduced herself as a hospital social worker. She sat down and asked me some questions about my living situation and whether I had support. I told her about leaving Rodney and staying with my mother. She pulled out some papers and started explaining different programs that could help me. She talked about WIC for food assistance and temporary programs for bills and low-cost childcare options for when I went back to work. Taking the papers from her hands felt embarrassing, like I was admitting I couldn't handle things on my own. But I also knew I needed to understand what help was out there because I didn't have $11,000 anymore. I folded the papers and put them in my purse and thanked her. She gave me her card and said to call if I needed anything else. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't know. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said hello and asked if this was me, and I said yes. She said her name was Jillian and she was Fred's wife. I froze because I thought maybe something was wrong at the clinic. But then she said Fred had mentioned what I was going through and she wanted me to know their family was here to help however I needed. She said she had baby items her kids had grown out of and she'd be happy to loan them to me. She also said she stayed home with their toddler and could watch my baby sometimes when I went back to work. I started crying right there on the phone because I'd been so focused on everything I'd lost that I forgot some people actually show up when things get hard. She gave me her address and told me to come by any time to look at the baby stuff. I thanked her about 5 times before we hung up. My mother asked who called, and when I told her, she smiled and said, "See, you're not alone in this." The phone rang again about a week and a half later. This time it was Rodney's mother Evelyn calling my mother's landline. My mother answered and Evelyn asked to speak with me. I took the phone into the guest room and sat on the bed. Evelyn started talking right away about how Rodney was her son, and gambling was a disease and I should give him another chance. She said he was going to meetings and trying to get better. I listened for a minute and then explained that the bank showed 2 months of withdrawals, but I'd found hidden credit card statements proving the gambling had been going on for 6 months. I told her he'd emptied our entire savings and lied to me every single day while I was pregnant. There was silence on the other end. Then her voice changed and got quieter. She said she didn't know it had been that long or that all the money was gone. She apologized for not raising him to be more responsible with money. I told her I appreciated her calling, but I'd made my decision. We hung up, and I sat there feeling strange, because part of me had expected her to keep defending him. I spent the next few days looking at apartments online. My mother said I could stay with her as long as I wanted, but I needed my own space for when the baby came. I found a small 1-bedroom place in a complex near my mother's house. The rent was more than I wanted to pay, but it was the cheapest option that wasn't completely run down. I drove over to look at it, and the carpet was old and the kitchen was tiny, but it had a separate bedroom for the baby. The manager said I could move in 2 weeks before my due date if I paid the deposit now. I used the last of my own savings to write the check. Signing the lease felt like the first real step forward I'd taken. My mother came with me a few days later to start moving my clothes and some furniture. Rodney agreed to let me take what I needed without arguing, which surprised me. Maybe he felt guilty, or maybe he just wanted to avoid another fight. Either way, I got a bed and a dresser and some kitchen stuff loaded into my mother's truck. Setting up the apartment became this project that kept me busy. I painted a bookshelf I'd bought at a thrift store for the baby's room. I washed all the little clothes my mother had saved from when I was a baby. The room was coming together, but it looked nothing like what I'd imagined back when I thought Rodney and I would be doing this together. Jillian came over one afternoon with her toddler and brought a crib and changing table her kids didn't use anymore. She helped me set them up and showed me how the crib converted into a toddler bed later. My mother bought me a rocking chair from a thrift store and we put it in the corner by the window. The nursery was mismatched and nothing matched, but it felt full of love from people who actually cared about me and the baby. Rodney texted my mother's phone asking to meet and talk about what happens after the baby is born. I agreed, but only at a coffee shop, and only with my mother waiting in the parking lot. I drove there and found him already sitting at a table in the back. He'd lost weight and his face looked tired. He started talking right away about how he'd been going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week and seeing a counselor. He said he was getting help and wanted me to know he was serious about changing. I asked him if he'd told his counselor the full truth about the money and how long it had been going on. His face changed and he got defensive, asking why that mattered if he was getting help now. I told him we could discuss custody arrangements through lawyers, but I wasn't coming back. He stood up fast enough that his chair scraped loud against the floor. He said he'd been going to meetings for 2 weeks and I couldn't even give him credit for trying. Then he walked out. I sat there for another minute finishing my water before going back to my car where my mother was reading a magazine. 3 weeks later, I woke up at 3 in the morning with pain in my lower back. I thought it was just normal pregnancy discomfort until the pain came back 20 minutes later, then again 15 minutes after that. I woke my mother up and told her I thought I was in labor. She got dressed faster than I'd ever seen and helped me to the car. We drove to the hospital and I breathed through contractions the whole way there. The nurse checked me and said I was 4 centimeters and this baby was coming today. They got me into a room and hooked up to monitors. The labor went on for hours and the pain got worse and worse. I kept thinking about how Rodney should be here holding my hand. But then I'd remember he chose gambling over saving for this moment. He chose slot machines over our daughter. My mother stayed with me the entire time. She held my hand and got me ice chips and told me I was doing great. At 6:47 that evening, my daughter finally came. The nurse put her on my chest and she was tiny and perfect and screaming. I looked at her face and felt this huge wave of love that made every hard choice worth it. My mother cried and took pictures and called her the most beautiful baby she'd ever seen. The first week home was harder than anything I'd ever done. My body hurt from giving birth and I was trying to figure out how to breastfeed while running on maybe 2 hours of sleep. The baby cried constantly and I had no idea what I was doing. My mother stayed with me those first few days, and that's the only reason I survived. She changed diapers and held the baby while I showered and made me eat even when I wasn't hungry. Jillian stopped by with meals, and that meant I didn't have to think about cooking. Rodney texted asking to meet his daughter. I told him I needed time to recover first. He sent back an angry message about how I was keeping him from his own child. Reading that reminded me exactly why I'd left. When the baby was 2 weeks old, I finally agreed to let him visit at my mother's house with her there as a buffer. He showed up exactly on time and stood in the doorway looking nervous. My mother let him in, and he walked over to where I was sitting with the baby. I put her in his arms, and he held her like she might break. Tears ran down his face, and for a second I felt sad about everything we'd lost. Then he started talking about how having a daughter should bring us back together, how we were a family now and needed to try again. I looked at him and said firmly that our daughter having 2 parents didn't mean those parents had to be married. I told him his relationship with her was separate from his relationship with me. His face got hard, and he handed the baby back and left without saying goodbye. I called Verity the next week and told her I was ready to file for legal separation and child support. She had me come into her office and we filled out paperwork that made everything feel real and official. Rodney would have to provide his financial information, which meant the court would see exactly how much money he made. Verity explained that the court would calculate support based on his actual income, not whatever he promised to pay. A few weeks later, the financial disclosure came back and it showed gambling debts I didn't even know about. He owed money to 3 different casinos. The court calculated his support payment and it wasn't generous, but it was something. More importantly, it was court-ordered, which meant I could actually count on it. Verity filed all the papers and told me it would take a few months to finalize everything. I signed where she showed me and walked out of her office feeling scared, but also clear about what I was doing. At 6 weeks postpartum, I settled into a routine that felt both exhausting and manageable. My mother took the baby Tuesday and Thursday mornings, so I could go to the grocery store without rushing or run to the pharmacy to pick up prescriptions. Jillian watched her Wednesday afternoons, which meant I could actually sleep for 2 hours straight without listening for crying. Those naps saved me because nighttime was still rough with feeding every 3 hours. Rodney came over every Sunday at noon for his supervised visit, and my mother let him in while I got the baby ready. He held her carefully and talked to her in this soft voice I'd never heard him use before. She was too young to really respond, but he didn't seem to care. After about 40 minutes, he'd look up at me and start talking about how we should try counseling together, or how he'd been clean from gambling for weeks now. I learned to cut him off fast and redirect back to the baby. The first few times I felt guilty for being so firm, but it got easier each week. He'd leave looking disappointed, and my mother would make tea while I fed the baby again. 3 months after I walked out, I started back at the clinic part-time, working Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Jillian kept the baby at her house those days and sent me pictures throughout the morning of her sleeping or making faces. My first paycheck went straight into my new savings account that had exactly $73 in it from what I'd scraped together. Rebuilding from zero felt impossible, but I deposited every check and watched the number grow by tiny amounts. Being a single mother was harder than anything I'd imagined, with work and bottles and custody schedules and never enough sleep. But my apartment stayed quiet without Rodney's complaints or lies. My daughter gained weight and smiled at me when I picked her up from Jillian's house. My mother called every morning to check on us, and Jillian texted me encouragement on rough days. I had people who actually showed up when they said they would. I was stronger than I thought I was when I walked out that door with just my purse.